Good morning. Wow, that sounds absolutely terrible. Good morning, everybody. I've been telling everyone, I hope the rumor is spreading far and wide, that I'm running on about 2 or 5% of voice remaining. And that's notwithstanding the fact that I'm running on about 40% energy right now. But as you'll see, even at 40%, I still have a lot to spare. So first and foremost, I just want to say this is a real, seeing all this materialize, seeing all of you here, it really means a lot to me. This has been a very Herculean effort, and I hope that effort shows in the manifestation of, first, your attendance, first and foremost, the caliber of the speakers, which, without exaggeration, are among the highest caliber, the highest quality speakers that can possibly be assembled on a conference related to the intersection of history, cartography, geography, and moreover, the geography of the Grand Canyon. So we have truly some giants from the worlds of cartography, geology, libraries and archives, history, applied cartography. I'm repeating myself, but truly every facet of map making that we can consider, we have rock star representation here, and I am so proud to be even part of the program, kind of commemorating and with such strong representation, excuse me. So I'm going to do myself a huge favor because frankly I'm exhausted and most of the hard work has been done. The conference is going and it's going to continue without a hitch, I believe. I'm going to transfer briefly to my presentation. I'm going to give a quick introduction and kind of contextualize a little bit more why we're all here. Matt, if you don't mind queuing that up. Yeah. So in the meantime, in the 30 or 45 seconds it takes to cue that up, I just want to say thank you again for coming. I personally offer you my promise that you will not be disappointed with the fantastic program we've laid out over the next 2 days. And I just ask that you all are patient with me as I struggle to use what last modicum of my voice remains as I introduce why we're here. I'm going to give a quick introduction on mapping Grand Canyon, or for those grammatical sticklers who are offended that I omitted the article mapping the Grand Canyon. And this is part one. So of course, as my colleague Paul mentioned, we're here, of course, to celebrate a well-known milestone in the greater Grand Canyon timeline. It is the centennial, of course, of the legislation signed in 1919 that led to the creation of Grand Canyon National Park, which protects portions of the greater Grand Canyon region as a U.S. national park with some of the strongest environmental and land designation that our country offers. So that's a significant milestone. Less well known, of course, is the fact that it's the sesquicentennial, a vocabulary word that I learned over the course of several months, marking the 150th anniversary of the famous John Wesley Powell 1869 exploration through the canyons of the Colorado River, including, of course, what is now known as the Grand Canyon, which effectively got its name from John Wesley Powell's 1869 and subsequent 1871 and 1872 exploration and effective mapping survey through the canyons of the Colorado River. And what we're looking at right now is a 1919 map published by Rand McNally, and I just wanted to kind of illustrate the demarcation, the formal demarcation of space. Although this is a private map, there was a subsequent map published in 1926 by the National Park Service, one of the most iconic maps of Grand Canyon National Park ever produced. So this gentleman here, this is one of our iconic protagonists, John Wesley Powell. And this is him in his younger years. He was probably, and we have some historians who could fact check me in the crowd, but he was in his early mid-30s when he commenced his first survey through the canyons of the Colorado River, which was effectively terra incognita. There was a conspicuous blank space on the maps of this region of northern Arizona. And mind you, this is an era of the mid-19th century when the United States is newly discovering itself. Just about a little bit more than a decade earlier, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848, which essentially ceded to this new country, the United States, large swaths of what was formerly, or what is now Mexico. So you have a new country in the middle of the 19th century gaining self-awareness, learning about its own territorial identity, effectively seeking to rectify the ignorance it had about itself. And geographic knowledge, of course, the most effective way of capturing and encoding and packaging geographic knowledge is, of course, through maps. And as I just mentioned, there was this conspicuous blank space, this unacceptable, frankly, for the bureaucrats and the policymakers in Washington, this unacceptable blank space that needed cartographic rectification. There needed to be a filling in of the geographic knowledge that would be effectively manifest in the science and art of cartography, those powerful visual manifestations that we all rely on. So I'm going to cruise through because I'm not the star of this show. Like I said earlier, we have assembled some true rock stars and giants, but I want to briefly just make a bold statement. And it's bold because many people in here have perhaps hiked rim to rim on multiple occasions. I know at least one of our speakers, at least a few of our speakers have done multiple river rafting trips through the entirety of the Colorado River and seen portions and nooks and crannies of the Grand Canyon that many of us can only hope to see in the course of our short lifetimes. But the bold statement I wish to make is that none of us truly knows the Grand Canyon. Even the most seasoned canyon adventurers, those rafters and hikers, those seasoned canyon adventurers and explorers, throughout the course of our short lives can only hope to see a small fragment, a small fraction of the entirety of this vast space that we now kind of matter-of-factly and almost take it for granted conceive of as this unified regional space. So indeed, it's the work of maps, the abstraction, the heuristic, the mental heuristic that allows us to take this huge space that if we were to deposit ourselves, and many of us have had the privilege of actually sitting on the rims or standing on the rims or hiking down to the depths of the Grand Canyon, if we've had that privilege, you'll know that in relation to this giant space, we're just mere specks, relatively insignificant specks. It's very humbling. It's definitely an act in humility growing, a very inspiring realization about our own roles in nature, in the universe, and our own scale. And one theme that I want to emphasize with maps is the role of scale, that very practical, operational characteristic of maps that most of my library colleagues, my WAMO colleagues know intimately. So I just want to give a quick primer on scale, and it's very straightforward. When we report scale, we're going to report it in ratios, representative fractions, and the denominator, the bottom part of that fraction, the larger that fraction gets, the smaller the cartographic scale, meaning 1 unit on that map refers to multiple more units on the real world. So when we're there, when we're in the depths of the Grand Canyon or at these iconic points like Ooh-Ah Point, which many of us have probably visited, or here visiting the confluence, a very sacred place for many of the native and many of the indigenous communities of the region, it is really the work of maps that allow us to take these small fragments of this huge space and help us, through our feeble human minds, make sense of it through this literal grand scale. This is a 2002 Landsat satellite image, multispectral satellite image, false color multispectral satellite image. And it's a fantastic image that reflects really what we're looking at here. But again, without these geographic and geospatial technologies and cartographic technologies, we would not have the luxury of viewing this space holistically as we do. So there's been a perpetual quest for a better map, and I need to rush through this very quickly. But we're going to hear throughout the course of the next 2 days, we're going to hear a lot about some very important characters in the chronology of Grand Canyon mapping, and we're going to learn about some certain maps are going to be repeated throughout this program regularly. One of the most iconic maps of the region is this July 1978 production, National Geographic map production called "The Heart of the Grand Canyon," and we have multiple experts who will tell you all about it. But I'm just going to mention it briefly to highlight the fact that this map was sought after. The gentleman who led the expedition for this topographic survey started effectively in the early 1970s. Mind you, this is a full century, a full 100 years after that famous John Wesley Powell 1869 exploration and 1871-72 explorations. But still, even 100 years later, there was still a quest for a better base map. There was still a desire to improve, to refine our geographic understanding of it, because the best maps at the time were those surveyed in 1902, 1903 by a character you'll hear a lot about as well, Francois-Émile Mott. And that map was not significantly or materially improved until a full 60 years later, when the USGS, United States Geological Survey, started integrating remote sensing and aerial photography methods. So the point I want to make here is that although, yes, we live in the early 21st century, inundated by, living in a geospatial revolution, inundated with big geographic data, there's always still new knowledge to be gained. There's always a better map to be pursued. And I totally mistimed this, and the fact that I'm half conscious probably exacerbates it. But I want to just highlight a couple important maps. Nick's going to have to indulge me. And hey, I put this together. I'm going to indulge myself. But I want to highlight this very important antebellum, this pre-Civil War map, and highlight some key cartographic specimens, if you will, of what the mapping landscape, what the cartographic landscape, you will, what the state of geographic knowledge was during the time of John Wesley Powell's exploration 150 years ago. This is a not so well-known map. It is the a map drawn in 1835 or 1836. It's actually not fully known when the map was drawn, but it's a map published in 1940 in a publication. So the actual publication in which this map was included didn't go to print until a full century later. But this map was drawn in 1835 or 1836 by Warren Angus Ferris, and it is a map of the Northwest Fur Country to the northwest of the Rocky Mountains. And it may be the very first depiction or explicit cartographic reference to the Grand Canyon ever made. If we look here at the southern tip of this map, we see here this text that says, quote, Great Canyon of the Colorado. And mind you, this was in 1835, 1836. By our modern cartographic sensibilities, it isn't the most sophisticated or refined map of the era. But think about it, in the early 19th century, still before the middle of that century, the state of territorial knowledge was really limited. So this map may indeed mark the first explicit reference to the Grand Canyon ever made. And you'll hear about another map as well, and I'll really go quickly through this. This is Baron Frederick von Egloffstein's 1858 map of the Rio Colorado of the West. And it is a fantastically gorgeous depiction. But as you can see, it is a significant act of artistic and cartographic license. As you can see here, in this big canyon of the Colorado, the course of the Colorado River itself is not known. It's a pure act of speculation. If we were to proceed with this sense of geographic knowledge, we would think that the Colorado River is a giant lake or has a giant lake in the middle of it. So, but nevertheless, this is a very innovative map in that Egloffstein introduced some cartographic innovations, especially with regard to the way he chose to depict three-dimensional topography through hill shading. So my point with this is that mapping, as my colleague Paul said, is not merely an act of scientific data gathering, but it's also very much an artistic practice of decision-making and exercising creative energies to correctly and sometimes with imagination go about depicting and imagining geographic space. And I'm going to quickly go through this because, again, we have experts who can talk all about these things. But I do want to highlight one last bit, and I'll just go through this slide quickly, some more cartographic license that was exercised in a map published in 1858. Again, the course of the Colorado River is purely speculated, and you have some interesting design work done to kind of illustrate the many sub-canyons and tributaries of the Colorado River, remarking Lieutenant Ives' 1858 overland journey through the canyon lands. But I want to highlight this, my friends, as we go through these maps and we see multiple unexplored territories. I want to highlight the fact that when John Wesley Powell set course with 9 men to map the canyon of the Colorado River to the first time collect information about the canyons of the Colorado River. The maps that he was working with were completely speculative and ill-informed. Very unreliable data was used to populate these maps. And the map that John Wesley Powell likely used on his visit, I learned from one of our speakers, from reading the publications of one of our speakers, a renowned historian, Richard Quateroli, is likely this map, this 1858 U.S. government publication that sought to omit any unreliable data. So in an abundance of caution, rather than lying by commission, they chose to simply omit it. So we have this conspicuous blank space, and that was part of the geographic ignorance that John Wesley Powell sought to rectify through his intrepid mapping endeavors. So as you can hear, guys, friends, I'm really struggling, but it doesn't matter. The program we have lined up can totally make up for how I'm struggling here. But importantly, John Wesley Powell's 1875 publication in Scribner's Monthly Magazine was the first map to effectively rectify, to correctly depict the course of the Colorado River. And that's important. In 1874, before a U.S. House committee, he declared, "The work has been completed. You have on the wall one of the preliminary maps of the region. It is but a tracing of the field sketches. The computations for latitude, longitude, and altitudes are not yet completed, nor have the triangles been computed, so that it is not a final map." But he proudly boasted, "There is now left within the territory of the United States no great unexplored region, and exploring expeditions are no longer needed for general purposes." I want to leave you with a final note, and hopefully I'll be feeling a little bit better tomorrow, and I can add some additional context to this. But all of us here are standing, even myself, a humble geographer who dabbles in cartography. I appreciate the kind words of my colleagues to celebrate my small contribution to the cartography of the Grand Canyon, but in the presence of cartographic rock stars like Tom Patterson, I'm a little embarrassed to get any accolades for my humble map here. But we all stand on the scientific shoulders of giants. People like Francois Milmot, Egloffstein, and Joseph Christmas Ives, the gentleman, the lieutenant on whose expedition Egloffstein was the cartographer and illustrator. And of course, John Wesley Powell. And I'm omitting dozens of other key visionaries, luminaries, scientists, explorers, intrepid people who bravely ventured into terra incognita to kind of build our collective geographic knowledge that we all enjoy and take for granted today. So the point I want to leave now, as I transition to our real speaker who can help fix up the mess I've left behind, is that we all stand on the cartographic shoulders of giants. And I think no one knows that better than our next speaker, Tom Patterson. And I regrettably don't have with me, I came ill-equipped and I should have a long list of his accolades, but I'm enough of a fanboy of Tom Patterson to know that without question, he is one of those absolute cartographic giants and rock stars. And in the humble world of cartography, it's nice to be acknowledged as such, because Tom Patterson has certainly, over the course of his decades-long career, has earned the title. Tom Patterson is a recently retired cartographer for the National Park Service. And when I speak proudly about the high-caliber presenters we have, it's Tom Patterson whose name I probably bring up first. When we all visit the Grand Canyon and receive those fantastic visitor maps, it's Tom Patterson who likely created those maps, almost certainly. And he's going to talk a little bit, and there's not one map of the Grand Canyon that Tom Patterson has created. He's created dozens. And apart from his work at the National Park Service as recently retired senior cartographer, making dozens of map products, not only for the Grand Canyon, but for all the national parks throughout the national park system, he's also a generous contributor to the open source cartographic community, which is critical. Tom Patterson is one of the lead designers and kind of originators of a project called Natural Earth. It is one of the best open source GIS data repositories for guys like me, amateur dabblers in cartography, who go looking for that raw cartographic base data. I depend on resources like Natural Earth and the generosity of people who are not only skilled and talented like Tom Patterson, but are also generous and willing to share their knowledge to help young people like myself and the students here at ASU and across the country continue standing on the collective cartographic and scientific shoulders of giants. I have eaten far too much into this program and into Tom Patterson's time. But without further ado, let me introduce the keynote for the first day of the Mapping Grand Canyon Conference, Mr. Tom Patterson. Please give him a round of applause.